Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Well, I'm sat here on a very cool evening towards the end of October, and I've got in front of me a lovely pint of Guinness, and I'm sat in the best pub in the area, in my humble opinion. Obviously, the opinion is slightly biased because I happen to be the proprietor and landlord of said pub. I am, of course, having a little drinky in the Riley Arms. So, the Riley Arms was founded in 2022. When we moved house, we had a little outhouse garage thing, and like a lot of sad blokes approaching that point in their life, my plan was to build a little pub. And you know what? It's very nice indeed. We've got a load of rugby shirts on the walls. I've got a load of scarves and football memorabilia. I've got my running medals, participation medals, of course. I've got a load of pictures printed out, and I've got some nice little sort of extra touches here. I've got a dartboard, got a piano, which unfortunately doesn't do so well out here, it being uninsulated. And the back bar, you've got the Riley Arms written across, and at the very far end of the bar, opposite me right now, is a lovely picture from the playoff final for Preston North End back in 2015 against Swindon at Wembley. And it's got my dad, my Uncle Mick, and me all having a pint at half-time when I believe they were a couple of goals up. Ends up being a bit of a walkover in the end. A brilliant day, and it's a lovely picture of my dad. I've got another nice picture of my dad actually opposite too, which is from his time in Tanzania, and just above that is a nice picture of me and him on the top of Sydney Harbour Bridge back in 2001, I believe. So the last episode, remember, I talked a lot about my dad, and I sort of don't really want to do too much of that in this episode, despite it being actually quite germane. This poem, as you heard at the very beginning, is one dedicated to a father. And you're probably wondering where I got that wonderful Welsh accent from. Spoiler alert, I did not. I think half of the battle in any kind of creativity is to know what you can do well and to know what maybe you can't do so well. And the gravelly-voiced Welshman that you heard at the beginning there was none other than Owen Staten, who was a storyteller. And he is obviously, as you can hear, a Welsh boy, and he's absolutely marvellous. He's got a great podcast called Time Between Times, where he tells stories. Some of them are folklore heavy, some of them are completely original, some of them are famous stories. But he's absolutely wonderful. He's a great podcaster. He was very generous with his time. Oh, yeah, that's another problem with this pub, the bloody locals. That's not my dog, by the way. My dog is finishing his food. Anyway, thank you, Owen. Well, Yakida. So I'm sat back here in the Riley Arms. I've had a brief interlude while I had to take the dog back in because he couldn't quite behave himself. And come back out. I'm sat here now having a very nice pint of stout. I thought about having a whiskey in honour of Dylan Thomas, but much as I've got a few nice looking drams lying around, I'm not much of a whiskey drinker. It gives me a bit of a headache really, so I'll just have to toast him with my pint here. And I'll also toast my dad over there at the end of the bar. Cheers, old dad. Sláinte. So, to the poem really. It's definitely one of the absolute, most well-known poems, I think, in all of English literature, or Welsh lit. And I think it's got so many things going for it that it's just worth pointing them out. If you ever look at it and you're wondering kind of what form it's in, if you've never studied poetry at any level, the form of this poem is called a villanelle. And a villanelle works in that you have a repeated refrain. So in this case we have do not go gentle into that good night. We also have rage against the dying of the light. And then this refrain is obviously repeated throughout. So villanelles they gain their power through repetition as much as anything else. And given that this poem was obviously written for his dying father, that's what that final line, I believe, is supposed to sort of connote. But let's just pick out some of these individual phrases, because one of the things that I always loved about this poem is that it is applicable to all sorts of things. It's applicable to the idea of the fading of genius, potentially, the fading of a talent. And not to get too autobiographical, but of course, Thomas himself being a study in caution to how alcohol and the creative muse can potentially combine to destroy you. Although I do think it's a little bit reductive just to sort of say, oh, here comes Dylan Thomas, the drunk Welsh poet. I think that's doing him a massive disservice. A lot of the things that actually killed him at the very end were down to a historic lung issue, and surprisingly, given that he was a huge drinker who liked to overdo it in every possible sense, I believe the evidence was fairly inconclusive that it was definitely the drink that killed him. I don't think it helped. I'm not gonna defend that. I don't think it helped one bit with a man who was already very, very fragile, and also a man who had, massive issues in his own personal life. Certainly towards the end. So to really sort of focus on this poem in its sort of minutiae, if we take a stanza sort of by itself. Let's take the second stanza. Though wise men at their end, no dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning. They do not go gentle into that good night. I think that line, because their words had forked no lightning, is just incredible. We talk about lightning in a bottle as a metaphor for the idea of being a genius, for striking out something and becoming something else, for being able to create something almost from nothing, like a lightning bolt. And that idea that your average person will never have that feeling. Their words had fought no lightning. Your average individual does not get to feel that. I don't know what that feels like. I've been writing poetry for years. I have yet to have a line as good as that. And I've made my peace with that to a degree. But this is part of it, is that to lean into the genius, the muse, can often be quite self-destructive, just like a storm. And we get the hint of the autobiographical here. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. We get this slightly more cosmic and celestial imagery, potentially. The sun in flight. This idea of something that is up there, forever giving, but also out of reach, and leads straight on to grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Again, it's just superb. And the villanelle form perfectly captures these little vignettes, these little sort of moments of what it means to be human, knowing that your time is fading. Now, this is not the poems of, say, Betjeman or Larkin, and about the reality and the banality of dying. It's a battle cry to what we should be, to what we should wish for. What does it mean to rage against the dying of the light? So when Owen and I discussed this poem, he did say that I should sit in my garden with a beer and watch the sun go down. Unfortunately, I'm in a north-facing garden, which is a bit of a pain. So I felt like the fitting setting of sitting in my little tiny garage pub, which has become increasingly cold since I came back in. If you can hear a slight shiver in my voice, it's not all emotion and inspiration. Some of it is just that it's a bit chilly and I'm in my pyjamas. And the dying of the light here can be obviously the literal, the metaphorical, but also, if you want to keep it literal, it could be the idea of the very last light to be left on. And if I were to link it back to my own father, I think of the idea of the dying of the light isn't just the sort of slightly cliche light at the end of the tunnel, death, etc., pushing back against it. It's also the last sunset that you might see, or the last time you see. I'm thinking of one of the most melancholy sights. I think is always when you are walking back from somewhere late at night and you can see sort of like the safety lights on in a pub or in a restaurant. And you feel like that's it, it's ended for the day. And for most of us, we get to go back again and do it all over again. But the idea, if that was your last time, if that was the final moment, then that is it. The dying of the light is proverbial. It's also sometimes very, very literal. And the last stanza, and you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So the sad height, it's interesting given, obviously, my specialism, if you like, will be with Mr. Larkin. And the idea of the sad height, he does mention, of course, with the old fools about the peak. It's a constant reference to the peak, for them is rising ground. There's a bit of a romantic element here, of course, with Wordsworth in the prelude. This huge peak, black and huge, sort of upreared its head. This idea of something being on a height that you cannot reach, which on some levels is seen as a celestial, wonderful thing, to reach the moon, to reach the sun. But actually, the idea of this sad height, is it a mountain peak? Is it a high window, to paraphrase a Larkin moment there? But it's this place where somebody is out of reach, no longer able to be seen for who they really are. And it says curse, bless. And ultimately a curse and a blessing. They might both be rubbish, they might both be fruitless and futile, but they are the last thing that you get the chance to utter. With your fierce tears, I pray. So we've got a curse, we've got a blessing, and then we've got a prayer. And I just think that what works so well about this poem is that it is both a battle cry and a call to arms, but it is also a lamentation that he knows, no matter how much he rages and rages, the dying of the light will happen, and that good night will have you, whether you go gently or not. It's a spellbinding poem, and one that I think everybody who has an interest in poetry should read and possibly even learn to recite, because the good thing with villanelles is it's actually quite easy to recite them, given the amount of repetition that's involved. It's a cracker. I've always found myself coming back to this poem at times of difficulty. I find it has a stirring sort of strength within it, which gives me something else. You know, I remind myself that, you know what, I'm going to bed tonight, but I get to wake up tomorrow morning. You know, I get to do it all over again. And sometimes you think, oh Christ, I've got to do it all over again. But it's a really good thing to think about, the idea of, you know, why are we sort of careering towards our own deaths, not fulfilling ourselves, not fulfilling what we really want from life. And if somebody told you, if you got a diagnosis, you know, I had a great colleague once, he was a wonderful mentor to me, and he said, you need to remember you're only one blood test away from being told that it's all over. And that really stuck with me. You know, you're only one blood test away from this whole thing being over, the little things that you're worrying about being suddenly thrown to the four winds, and you having to deal with, actually, my days could be numbered. You know, and that's the thing, to quote Christopher Hitchens, you know, we have an appointment with death. We don't know when it is, we don't know when it will be, we don't know where it will be, we don't know how it will happen, but we know that it will happen. I'll cover some of this, I'm sure, in other cheery moments of an episode. Going back to something slightly cheerier, of course, with Mr. Thomas, I wanted to sort of take on his Welshness, if that's okay, because as an English pansy with no Welsh heritage, I'm aware I'm completely underqualified to talk about him. Hence why I wanted Owen to read his poem, because I felt like it would just be right. But having done more research on him over the past few weeks, I was actually quite surprised to see that despite his lionisation as this voice of Welsh poetry, the man himself didn't actually speak Welsh, or claimed that he really couldn't speak it. I think he did as a child, but claimed that he found it, you know, difficult to do, and I think maybe distanced himself from it when he got older. And I'm just going to read this short segment from an article about him, which really made me laugh, actually, in spite of myself. Robert Pocock, a friend from the BBC, recalled, I'm not going to do a Welsh accent here because that would be disrespectful. I actually don't even know if Robert Pocock is Welsh. I would assume he is. Recalled, I only once heard Dylan express an opinion on Welsh nationalism. He used 3 words. 2 of them were Welsh nationalism. That made me laugh. The idea, I guess, of the poet's persona after death becomes the thing. The same, I suppose, as the whole, you know, Dylan Thomas, the drunk Welsh poet. I've got a brilliant sort of cartoon strip thing that I bought from Stephen Collins, the cartoonist of The Guardian. Still one of my most prized possessions. It's poets with smartphones, and it shows Larkin sat on this train taking a selfie, going a train literally patched with newlyweds, which is really quite funny. And the final panel is actually Dylan Thomas, and it says, "Do not go gentle into that." And you can see the autocorrect on his phone, and it says, "Good morning," and other things. And then his phone runs out of battery, and he just shouts, "Oh, bollocks!" and see him knock back a shot of whiskey. It's tough to not parody and satirise these people, because by looking at them in the literary canon, we do reduce them, we do take away some of who they really were. I mean, Dylan Thomas today could well have been a very, very well respected journalist. That was his first calling. He ended up being a sort of poet by default, and yet spent pretty much the entirety of his adult life in real poverty, real hardship, and in a way had this most mixed of careers, because he didn't really, in his own mind, I think, ever make it. And like a lot of sort of tragic earlier deaths, his work lives on. And of course, with all of his hard drinking and womanizing and all of that stuff, all I can say is sign me up. I'm joking, by the way. Obviously, it's one of those things that sounds very rock and roll, but in reality must be. No, it still sounds pretty good, actually, now I think about it. But yeah, anyway, moving on. I really hope that you've enjoyed me taking on something a bit different and a little bit out of my comfort zone here. I hope you enjoyed Owen's reading. And like I said, if you ever want to hear him and his gravelly Welsh tones again, do yourself a favour and subscribe to the Time Between Times podcast. It's absolutely cracking, and one of my favourite podcasts too. I'm just a humble fan in that regard. And in terms of me, I am very, very happy to say that my download numbers have been really rocketing recently, which is great. I'm getting featured on BBC York very soon, and I have hopefully got everything lined up to accept a subscription for anybody that really wants to request a poem and wants to sort of, go big on it, and maybe, donate a little bit to keep the lights on, to help me rage against the dying of the electric lights, but also to help me run the podcast. I've kept myself on an independent server with Buzzsprout. I don't get paid anything by them. I have to pay them, but every time I read the small print, I do find myself thinking, if I'm not paying for a service, if it's free, then my content isn't my own, frankly. And it'll be a cold day in hell before I give up my intellectual property for the sake of saving a couple of quid every month. So if you'd like to help me continue to make an independent podcast, please do subscribe. You can get yourself a poem, and I'm very, very happy to interact with you and do what you would like me to do with it in terms of a fitting setting and everything like that. Most importantly, though, guys, I'm just glad that I get to make something that makes me feel true to myself. I'm an English teacher by trade, but I'm a poet at heart. And to talk about this stuff is never ever a chore, always a pleasure. All the best, and rage against the dying of the light. I might have a whiskey, actually. Yes, Monty, we know you're a big scary dog, a big scary woofer. Well, you would be, but all you do is gruff at things outside. If someone actually came into our house trying to burgle us, all you do is roll over on your back and ask to get your tummy tickled. Yes, we know it's true. You great big tart.